There is a mental shift so profound, so empowering, that once you adopt it, the way you move through life will never be the same. It's this: act as if you can't fail. Not because you're reckless, not because you're ignoring risk, but because failure is no longer part of your operating system. It's not even on the table. It's been removed completely. You don't consider it. You don't entertain it. You don't measure your steps by how much you might lose. You measure them by how far you can go. Because the man who acts as if failure is impossible moves differently. He speaks with more certainty. He plans with more clarity. He executes with more speed, and those qualities, confidence, clarity, speed, they are what create momentum. And momentum is how empires are built. You see, most people hesitate not because they're incapable, but because they've made failure an option. They leave the door cracked open, just in case, a backup plan, a way out. And so they move half-heartedly, they plan halfway, they speak softly, they ask life for permission. But the man who acts as if he can't fail does not move halfway. He moves all in. He decides and then behaves like the decision is final. He doesn't wonder if it's going to work, he makes it work. And that posture, that mindset, that unwavering inner stance, it changes everything. Let's break this down into something practical. Imagine if the outcome was already guaranteed. Imagine if you knew beyond all doubt that you couldn't lose. How would you move today? What would you say yes to? What would you stop procrastinating on? What conversation would you finally have? What decision would you stop delaying? That's the exercise. That's the challenge. You don't need to wait for certainty. You create it by behaving like a man who already holds it. And here's what you'll discover. When you act as if failure is off the table, you begin taking bigger, bolder steps. You stop shrinking in rooms. You stop asking for permission to lead. You stop apologizing for wanting more. You start speaking up, you start shipping the work, you start following through, and people begin to respond. Not because you're louder, not because you're faking anything, but because you're aligned with a version of yourself that believes deeply in the mission and refuses to retreat from it. Now let's be clear, this doesn't mean you'll never experience setbacks. It means you stop interpreting those setbacks as failure. You see them as data, as feedback, as part of the path. Because when failure is removed as a final destination, everything becomes a step, a lesson, a pivot. You can't lose because you've already decided you're going to win. Eventually, inevitably, that posture creates power. You don't crumble. You adapt. You don't stall. You correct. And over time, your resilience compounds. Let me ask you something. What have you been avoiding because you're afraid it might not work? What project, what business, what conversation, what leap, and more importantly, what would happen if you stopped asking, what if I fail, and started asking, what would I do if I couldn't? That one question removes the ceiling, it removes the self-doubt, and it forces you to act from possibility, not protection. The man who acts as if failure is impossible doesn't play small, he doesn't need a parade, he doesn't need applause, he builds because he's committed. He leads because it's who he is, and the world around him begins to shift. Opportunities show up, people pay attention. Not because he begged for them, but because certainty attracts. People trust the man who trusts himself. Not blindly, but bold, because boldness is rare. And what's rare becomes valuable. Now let's go deeper. Most fear of failure isn't fear of the outcome, it's fear of judgment, fear of what others will say, fear of how it might look. But the man who acts as if he can't fail has already made peace with public perception. He's not building for applause, he's building for legacy, for impact, for alignment with who he knows he's supposed to be. And because of that, he moves with freedom. Freedom from opinion, freedom from delay, freedom from the fear that traps most people in average. When you remove failure from your vocabulary, you reclaim your focus. You no longer waste energy worrying about what might go wrong. You use that energy to build what must go right. You invest it into systems, decisions, actions. And those investments multiply. They compound into results, into mastery, into movement that no longer needs hype to sustain it. Let's now talk about consistency. The man who acts as if failure is not an option doesn't rely on emotion to move. He relies on discipline. Because if failure doesn't exist, then skipping the process no longer makes sense. There is no room for, I don't feel like it. He trains, he builds, he finishes, because his standard is set by his identity, not his mood. That's what makes him reliable. That's what gives him momentum, and that's what keeps him climbing when others stall. Understand this. You are allowed to act boldly before the results arrive. You are allowed to move like a winner before you've won. Not to impress others, but to become who the result requires. You are not pretending. You are preparing. Every step you take in faith, every decision made without the backup plan of failure, is a signal to your subconscious, this is who I am now. And the more you act like that man, the more natural it becomes. So let me leave you with this. The difference between the man who rises and the man who stays stuck is not talent, it's not luck, it's not even timing. It's posture. It's the decision to act as if failure has already been ruled out, to move as if the outcome is already written, and your job is simply to walk it out. That decision changes how you move, and how you move changes everything. When you begin to act as if failure is impossible, a subtle transformation begins within you. You start removing hesitation from your steps. You stop overthinking your moves. You stop giving your fears more time than your plans. And something extraordinary happens. You start building momentum. Not the kind of momentum that comes from a lucky break, but the kind that's earned. The kind that comes from aligned behavior, from doing what needs to be done again and again, regardless of mood or opinion or circumstance. And that kind of momentum becomes your edge. It makes you unstoppable, not because everything goes right, but because nothing makes you quit. Let's now look at the practical difference between acting like you might fail and acting like you can't. The man who acts like failure is possible over-prepares. He overthinks, he second-guesses, he seeks approval before action, he studies every option but moves on none. He waits, he hesitates, he builds pressure until he breaks. But the man who acts as if failure isn't even in the equation, he simplifies. He decides quickly, he moves swiftly, he doesn't waste energy on doubt because his energy is committed to execution. And that alone, the ability to move fast and with clarity, separates him from 99% of people. You have to understand this. When failure is removed from the conversation, your creativity expands. You no longer see problems as threats, you see them as puzzles, and puzzles are solvable. That mindset shift creates confidence, not because you suddenly know everything, but because you trust yourself to handle whatever comes next. You trust your ability to figure it out. And that kind of trust is powerful. Know this, because most people don't have it. They trust outcomes. You trust yourself. And that trust multiplies your advantage. Let's talk now about speed. When failure doesn't scare you, you begin to move faster. You don't linger in indecision. You don't dilute your actions with excuses. You execute, and the world responds to execution. Not intentions, not potential, execution. And speed of execution matters. It's not about rushing, it's about eliminating delay. Most people lose not because they're incapable, but because they're slow. Slow to commit, slow to act, slow to follow through. But the man who acts as if failure is impossible makes decisions in minutes that others stretch across months. And that speed compounds into results while others are still thinking about starting. Let's now address responsibility. When failure is no longer a fallback, you become the variable. You become the reason it works or doesn't. And that level of responsibility is rare, but it's also freeing because you stop blaming, you stop waiting, you stop pointing fingers, and you start building, you start adjusting. You start owning every inch of your progress. No more hoping, no more wishing. Just work, just discipline, just ownership. That's the mindset of a builder, a leader, a man who no longer gives himself the luxury of excuses. Let's now bring this into your daily decisions. What would change if failure was off the table this week? What project would you push to the finish line? What conversation would you stop avoiding? What new standard would you set? This is how you apply the mindset. Not in theory, but in action. Look at your calendar. Look at your routines. Do they reflect a man who believes failure is even possible? Or do they reflect someone still hedging, still holding back, still waiting? The man who's already decided doesn't hesitate. He acts with precision, with courage, with speed. And that pattern builds a future no one can deny. Let's talk now about identity. Because the man who believes failure is off the table has made a decision far deeper than confidence. He's made a decision about who he is. And once you decide who you are, everything else gets easier. You don't wonder what to do next. You ask, what would a man like me do? And then you do it. Your standards change. Your language sharpens. You no longer speak with doubt. You speak with certainty. And that certainty carries into how you walk, how you train, how you lead, how you show up for the day. You see, the mind adapts to the identity you feed it. If you keep repeating, I don't want to fail, your focus remains on failure. But if you say, I'm the man who gets it done, your brain begins to look for alignment. Your thoughts, your habits, your actions, all of them start moving toward the identity you've claimed. This is why you must be ruthless with your self-image. Protect it. Guard it. Rehearse it. Speak it aloud. And most importantly, act it out. Because the fastest way to install a new identity is to behave like it's already true. Let's talk about emotional resilience. One of the greatest benefits of acting like failure is not possible is that you stop being derailed by emotions. You don't spiral when something doesn't go your way. You don't quit when things feel heavy. You simply adjust. You shift. You evolve. Because that's what people who can't fail do. They find another route. They don't sit in defeat. They don't replay the loss. They pivot and progress. And that mindset makes you immune to the kind of emotional turbulence that takes most people out of the game. And let me leave you with this. When you live this way, when you build your decisions, your routines, your attitude around the assumption that you will not fail, you start to see yourself differently. Not as someone trying to succeed, but as someone simply walking out a result that's already done. That mindset doesn't make you reckless. It makes you committed. And in a world of hesitation, commitment is rare. And what's rare becomes powerful. When you begin to operate as if failure is not an option, your mind stops looking for exits. And something remarkable happens. Your focus sharpens. You no longer waste energy entertaining doubts. You no longer burn time replaying worst-case scenarios. Your mental bandwidth, once hijacked by fear, becomes a laser, and that laser locks onto one thing: execution. This is what separates the man who moves with power from the one who hesitates. The man who's eliminated failure from the conversation isn't fearless, he's committed. And that commitment hardens him, it strengthens his posture, it puts gravity in his voice. Because he's already decided, I'm not leaving without results. Let's now speak about clarity. Most people don't lack motivation, they lack direction. They haven't defined what winning looks like, so they drift. But the man who acts as if failure is impossible creates clarity by force. He defines what success is in no uncertain terms and then moves with urgency toward it. There's no vague goal, no loose intention, just crystal clear targets. He knows where he's going, and more importantly, he knows why. Now, clarity fuels him. It simplifies his decisions. It eliminates distractions, because when you know what you're building, you stop entertaining what doesn't belong in your blueprint. Now let's bring this down to discipline. Every time you act in alignment with your highest standard, even when it's inconvenient, you are proving to yourself that failure is not part of your identity. That proof stacks. Every rep, every early morning, every project you complete without being told. All of it becomes psychological evidence that reinforces your belief, this will work because I will not stop until it does. Most people seek evidence before they move. You create evidence by moving. That's the difference. Now, let's talk about leadership. Not of others, but of yourself. The man who acts as if failure is impossible doesn't need a supervisor. He doesn't wait for reminders. He doesn't need someone watching over his shoulder. His goals are internalized. He is governed by principle. And when a man leads himself well, others begin to follow. Not because he asks, but because leadership, when lived, is magnetic. Your consistency becomes a signal. Your energy becomes a map. Your results speak louder than your voice ever could. And speaking of results, let's clear something up. They don't lie. Your current outcomes are not judgments of your worth, but they are accurate reflections of your systems, habits, and mindset. If you don't like your results, you don't need more affirmations. You need alignment. You need to ask, does my daily routine reflect someone who cannot fail? If not, change it. You're not behind. You're not broken, but you may be misaligned. And alignment, not ambition, is what produces transformation. Let's go further. Think about how you use your time. Every man has the same hours in the day, but not every man assigns those hours the same meaning. The man who acts as if he cannot fail doesn't kill time. He uses it. He protects it. He fills it with high-leverage action. And that doesn't mean he never rests. It means his rest is intentional. He recovers with purpose. He guards his mornings. He shields his mind from noise, because he understands that energy, like time, is a finite asset, and if you burn it on the irrelevant, you won't have it for the essential. Let's speak now of identity reinforcement. This is not about faking anything. It's about behaving in accordance with your chosen outcome before it arrives. The more often you do that, the more natural it becomes. At first, it may feel forced. You may question yourself. You may not feel ready. But readiness is a result of action, not a prerequisite for it. You don't wait until you feel like a winner to act like one. You act like one until your reality agrees. Here's something very few understand. Certainty is not a personality trait. It's a practice. You become certain by acting decisively over and over again, especially when the outcome is unclear. That repetition of bold, aligned behavior builds certainty into your nervous system, and soon what once felt risky becomes normal. You don't flinch, you don't second guess, you move, and that movement compounds. Let's talk now about problem solving. When failure is removed as an option, every problem becomes a doorway. You stop seeing problems as dead ends, you start seeing them as invitations. Every setback becomes a signal. Here's where I refine, here's where I improve, here's where I adapt. That mindset is rare, but it's also essential, because life will test you. It will apply pressure. And if you view that pressure as a sign to stop, you'll never get far. But if you see it as feedback, as fuel, nothing can break you. Every hit becomes momentum. And now we return to one core idea. Identity is destiny. You don't get what you want. You get what you are. So if you want unstoppable results, you must become the man who acts as if they're already his. Not someday, not later, now, in how you think, in how you train, and how you speak, in how you show up when no one's clapping, when no one's watching, when no one's validating. That's the real test. And when you pass it, repeatedly, you rise. Quietly, surely, and without asking for permission. When you act as if failure is impossible, you begin to recognize a deeper truth, that most barriers are internal, not external. What stops a man is not the world. It's his hesitation, his self-doubt, his fear of what might happen if he gives everything and still doesn't win. But here's the paradox. The only way to guarantee failure is to never go all in. The man who acts as if success is inevitable never holds back. He doesn't ask, what if it doesn't work? He asks, what if I don't give it everything I've got? That shift changes the game, because now risk isn't in the doing, it's in the not doing. Let's now address one of the great lies of modern thinking, that caution is wisdom. It's not. Caution is often disguised fear. The man who always waits for the perfect time, the perfect information, the perfect alignment, that man never moves. He becomes a master of preparation and a stranger to progress. But the man who acts as if failure isn't possible, he doesn't wait for perfect. He moves with what he has, and by moving, he gains what others are still searching for. Clarity, experience, momentum. Action is the antidote to fear, and clarity is the reward for action. Let's talk about how this mindset affects your relationships. When you carry yourself like someone who cannot fail, you stop needing approval. You stop performing for others. You start speaking clearly, setting boundaries, saying what you mean without apology. That doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you free. People trust you more. Not because you always say the right thing, but because you're real. You're grounded. You're not playing a part. You've stopped rehearsing. You've started leading. And that kind of presence changes the tone of every room you enter. Let's speak now of internal congruence. When your actions align with your belief that failure is off the table, you begin to feel peace. Not because everything is easy, but because everything is aligned. You are no longer divided, no longer pretending one thing while doing another. You've stepped into full agreement with your future. That's what most people are missing. They affirm greatness, but live small. They speak vision, but act timid, and their results reflect that tension. But you've chosen a different road. You act from your destination. You show up today like the man you'll need to be when the outcome arrives. That's congruence, and that's power. Let's now look at the way you handle failure when it shows up in disguise. Not as a dramatic loss, but as silence, as delay, as slow progress. Most people fold here. They start to wonder, maybe this wasn't meant for me. But the man who's already ruled out failure doesn't ask if it will happen. He knows it's already done. So the delay doesn't shake him. The silence doesn't stop him. He continues. And that continuation, that relentless forward motion, is what makes success not just possible, but inevitable. Let's speak now about how this posture shapes your future. When you act as if failure is not real, you start making decisions from where you're going, not from where you are. You stop budgeting from your limitations and start building from your potential. You don't ignore reality, but you also don't let it dictate your ceiling. Most people spend their time reacting, but the man who's already decided to win, create, he sets the tempo. He doesn't chase life, he designs it. And that design over time becomes the life others call impressive. But for him, it's just normal. Because he's been acting like this for years. Before the applause, before the milestones, before the recognition. Now let's get practical. What would your week look like if failure were truly impossible? What would your day look like? What habits would become non-negotiable? What excuses would instantly die? These are the questions that bring power into your schedule. Not motivation, not hype, just aligned action. Real change happens when your behavior no longer negotiates with your doubts. When your calendar reflects your future. When your standards speak louder than your emotions. And here's the truth. People will try to talk you out of this mindset. They'll say you're being unrealistic, that you should prepare for things to go wrong. But understand this. Most people live in mental prisons built from other people's fears. That's not your path. Your path is ownership. Your path is movement. Your path is faith, backed by relentless execution. You don't need a guarantee, you are the guarantee, because your discipline, your focus, and your standard have become your insurance policy. Let me end this part with one idea. The most dangerous man in the room is not the loudest. He's the one who's already decided he can't fail. He's the one who keeps showing up when everyone else gets tired, who keeps building when no one is watching, who keeps executing when no one is clapping. Why? Because he doesn't need permission. He doesn't need certainty. He is the certainty. And that mindset creates a future that others will call destined. But you'll know it was built on a decision you made a long time ago. When you act as if failure is impossible, something fundamental shifts in how you perceive effort. Effort is no longer a gamble. It's no longer a question of will this pay off. It becomes an investment with guaranteed return. Not always immediate, not always visible, but always there. Because now every rep, every hour, every action is a brick, and you already believe the wall will be built. That belief allows you to move without hesitation, to give your best without fear of waste. Because you know this, nothing is wasted when it is aligned with your mission. Let's talk now about how this affects your discipline. Discipline is often misunderstood. People think it's about grinding through discomfort, about willpower. But real discipline at this level isn't hard. It's inevitable, because you're not forcing yourself anymore. You're not convincing yourself anymore. You're simply doing what the man who wins would do, because you've already chosen to become him. When failure is not part of your identity, skipping the process no longer makes sense. Discipline becomes a reflex. You wake up and execute. Not because you have to, but because you can't imagine not. And here's the beauty of that. When discipline becomes identity, life gets simpler. You don't waste energy negotiating with yourself. You don't wonder if you're doing the right thing. You know. That certainty clears mental clutter. It frees you. It allows you to channel all your focus into creation, into results, into becoming more. While others are paralyzed by options, you move with clarity. While others get stuck in indecision, you've already begun. And starting again and again and again, is what creates separation. Now we must address setbacks. Because even the man who acts as if failure is impossible will face them. But he doesn't interpret setbacks the same way. He doesn't call a delay a defeat. He doesn't see a slow day as a sign to quit. He sees every challenge as part of the curriculum. He knows the process includes resistance, that it's there to sharpen him, not stop him. So, he doesn't slow down. He adjusts, he adapts. And most importantly, he keeps going, because for him, stopping is not an option. Quitting is not on the menu. He made his decision once, and he honors it daily. Let's now speak of reputation. Not the one you have with the world, but the one you have with yourself. When you act as if you can't fail, you begin to build trust in your own word. And that trust changes everything. Because now when you say, I will, you believe it. You don't question whether you'll follow through, you expect it. And that self-expectation becomes your new floor, your new standard. You stop needing motivation. You stop needing reminders. You become your own source of momentum. And let's talk about competition. The man who acts as if failure is impossible doesn't compete with others. He doesn't check rankings. He doesn't obsess over what the next man is doing. His standard is internal. His bar is set by the future version of himself, and that is who he races. While others are distracted by comparison, he's focused on execution, and that solitude gives him speed. It gives him peace. It gives him the space to innovate, to grow, to build something no one else can duplicate, because it came from within. Now let's examine how this posture affects your communication. When failure is not an option, you begin to speak differently. Your words carry weight, not volume, weight. You don't need to talk often, but when you do, it lands. You say what you mean. You ask for what you want. You don't fill the room with noise, you fill it with presence. Because you no longer speak to be heard, you speak to move things forward. And that economy of language builds respect. People start to listen when you speak, because you've proven that your words come with action. And speaking of action, let's revisit the relationship between thought and motion. Most people believe they need more information, but what they really need is more movement. Action is the fastest way to learn. It's the fastest way to clarify. It's the fastest way to build belief. You don't wait for answers, you act, and let the answers meet you in motion. The man who acts as if failure is impossible understands this. He doesn't get stuck planning endlessly. He doesn't need perfect timing. He moves. And by moving, he separates himself from the masses who are still waiting for signs. Let me give you something practical to consider. When your alarm rings tomorrow morning, ask yourself, what would the man who never fails do next? And then do it. Don't negotiate. Don't think. Just move. Because that moment, that first decision of the day, is where your standard is either kept or compromised. Stack enough of those kept promises and you become a force. A man whose life becomes inevitable. A man whose word becomes law. Not to others, but to himself. So, here is your reminder. You are not trying to win. You have already won internally, and now you are simply walking that out. You are not hoping things work. You have already decided they will. And that decision is what makes the difference. Not someday, today, not when it's easy, now. Because that is who you are. And when you move from that place, the world begins to rearrange itself around your certainty. There is a point on this journey where everything quiets down. You've made the decision, you've acted on it, you've endured the resistance, and now it's not about proving anything. It's not about showing up with noise or theatrics. It's about continuation. The man who acts as if failure is impossible no longer needs permission. He doesn't need reminders. He doesn't need to be inspired. He is the standard now. Every move he makes is a reflection of who he's become, not a performance, a pattern, a permanent state of execution built from thousands of private decisions no one saw. Let's make one thing clear. You don't rise by accident. You rise because you've removed the idea of failure from your framework. Not because it's impossible in the world, but because it's impossible for you. You will not stop. You will not turn back. You will not accept anything less than completion. And that level of personal contract, where you've made the promise to yourself and closed every exit, that is what creates inevitability. So that's what makes progress predictable. That's what makes success quiet, consistent, and unbreakable. Well, let's talk about vision. Because when failure is no longer in the equation, you are free to dream bigger. You no longer design your goals based on what's safe, you design them based on what's true. And truth has no limit. It doesn't care about how long it takes, it doesn't shrink to match your current level, it pulls you upward. It expands your horizon. And the man who walks with the belief that he cannot fail dares to pursue visions so large, so personal, so important, that they demand a new level of him. Not because he wants to impress anyone, but because he refuses to die with potential still locked inside him. Let's speak about grace. When you live this way, with boldness, with fire, with total alignment, it becomes easier to be graceful. Not because you're soft, but because you're secure. You no longer waste time proving. You stop competing for attention. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to defend your journey. You simply are. And that quiet confidence lets others feel strong around you, because your energy is rooted, grounded, settled. You are not desperate to succeed, you are committed to it. And commitment, when fully lived, does not need to shout. Let's now revisit fear, because fear doesn't disappear, it transforms. In the beginning, fear says, what if it goes wrong? But when you've walked long enough in alignment, fear becomes fuel. It sharpens your senses, it raises your awareness. And instead of stopping you, it becomes a signpost that you are still on the edge of growth. The man who acts as if failure is impossible doesn't eliminate fear, he simply refuses to obey it. He uses it, he keeps moving forward with it in his pocket, but never in control. Let's bring this home to your daily life. When you wake tomorrow, how will you carry yourself? What habits will reflect that failure is no longer an option? What will you no longer tolerate? What will you finally take action on without waiting? These are